and great by choice. His most recent publication is Turning the Flywheel. It explores how leaders can best harness the flywheel effect to build and accelerate momentum. We're thrilled to have Jim join us today. I'll be back at the end of Jim's presentation to help facilitate Q&A, so please get your questions ready and submit them through the Zoom platform. And with that, let me turn it over to Jim.
Good afternoon, and Dan, thank you so much for bringing all of us together in a spirit of service to the business community and the business community to the world at large. In that spirit of service, I am having all of my proceeds for this, 100% of them donated directly to a nonprofit called the Greenhouse Scholars, whose mission I relate to, their cause, to help low-income young women and men get through college as an inflection point and then go on to return to contribute back to their communities. A marvelous, virtuous flywheel of life. Good is the enemy of great. And I've had the great joy to be able to spend now 3 decades of my life in pursuit of one big question: what makes a great company tick? It's a very data-driven approach. We have more than 6,000 years of combined corporate history in our research database. And it's done with a particularly rigorous methodology that came about in partnership with my research mentor, Jerry Porras, when we were doing our research for Built to Last at the Stanford Business School. And that methodology is very simple. The idea being you find historical matched pairs. You find pairs of companies that were in the same time, same resources, same potential at the exact same moment in history, but then they diverge. And one becomes great and the other doesn't, for example. And the key is you ask a series of why questions. Why and what explains the difference, and from that to derive insights and principles. You ask, for example, why? Why do some startups and small and mid-sized businesses grow to become iconic, visionary, enduring great companies, and others in the same circumstances do not? You ask, why do some companies make the leap from good to great, while other companies in the same circumstances do not? You ask, why do some companies fall from great to good to mediocre to bad to irrelevant to gone, while others in the exact same circumstances continue to rise? They sustain their momentum. And you ask, why? Why do some companies prevail in uncertainty? It's a word that should ring right now. In uncertainty, even chaos, when hit by big, fast-moving forces, shocks and turbulent disruptions that they can neither predict nor control, and yet they overperform, while others in those same turbulent environments do not. These are among the questions that we've wrestled with over the last 30 years and the 6,000 years of combined corporate history done in this rigorous methodology. I believe questions are better than answers. And the best way I can be of service to all of you is not to give you answers. It's actually to give you questions. And so I am going to organize my session here today as a set of 5 questions. And your homework is going to be to take these 5 questions away and with your team to wrestle with each of the 5 questions. That is going to be your takeaway. So take out a sheet of paper and begin with question number 1. I want you to have all 5 on a paper when you're done. Question number 1, do we have 90% or more of the key seats on our bus filled with the right people? I start with people, because one of the things we've learned over and over again, it doesn't matter the circumstance, is the vital importance, if you want to come out of any situation with momentum, of first who. All of the greatest leaders that we studied in our research, they always took the approach of saying, I don't need to figure out where to drive the bus. That's not my first question. I need to first figure out who should be on the bus, who should be in the key seats, and who should be off the bus. And by focusing first on getting the key seats filled with the right people, getting that bus filled with those people, and then figuring out where to drive it, we can best deal with uncertainty. See, because if you can't predict the what, and I promise you, you can't predict the what, then your ultimate hedge against the uncertainty of what's coming next is to have the people who can adapt to whatever might be coming. All we know is that it will be a surprise, and then another surprise, and then another surprise. This is just life. If you were going to go up and climb a big, scary mountain that's never been climbed before, what is your single most important decision? Who you have on the other end of the road. Now, over the years, I've challenged CEOs and leaders of companies to really push for their key seats, their absolutely essential seats, to get above 90% filled with the right people. And they'd come back and they would say, well, that's difficult. There's a war for talent. It's hard to get enough of them. But this is the time when everything's unfrozen. It's a great time to think about how do we seize this as a time to really be rigorous to ensure that we have 90% of our key seats filled with the right people. Now, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you go about doing this? Do you do it? Think of it as sort of two approaches, two tendencies. One tendency is to get 90% of your key seats filled with right people by developing people into the people who are fabulous in those seats. The other is to replace people, to have a tendency to more quickly act to replace in a key seat if somebody's operating in a B and not getting to an A. Question is, which is the right approach? Well, it actually turns out that the data shows, when we look across all the great executives, about 50% of them had a tendency towards develop, and about 50% of them had a tendency towards replace. Let's take two of the greatest chief executives of the last 50 plus years. Anne Mulcahy, who saved Xerox, and Katharine Graham of the Washington Post. Now, these two extraordinary chief executives, towering figures, iconic role models, they both were obsessed with ensuring that they had their key seats with the people who could really make those companies great. But how they got there was a bit different. Anne Mulcahy was a classic tend toward develop people and help them grow into those key seats. And Katharine Graham, on the other hand, who took over the company in the wake of a personal tragedy, losing her husband, and was just trying to figure out how to really lead this. And her view was, I am not the person to develop people into those. I need people who can fill those much more quickly. And if someone's not making it in a key seat, I will replace them. Here we have two great level 5 leaders, two great CEOs, two different approaches, but one end result, those key seats. And that's what you must do. Now, there's a key phrase that came up in Good to Great to never lose sight of, and that is the idea of being sure to be rigorous, not ruthless, in exercising this action. Now, let me talk about, I want to share a story. One of my dear friends, a fellow named General Lloyd Austin, he graduated West Point in, I believe, 1975. And General Austin went on to have a very storied career, became a 4-star general officer, and ended up with his last posting being commander of CENTCOM. CENTCOM is the basically the place where you have responsibility for all allied forces from Syria to Pakistan. It's a huge job. And we got to talking one day about his career arc. And he told me this story about how a few years out of West Point, he was worrying about his success. He was worried about his career. Was he getting promoted fast enough? Was he achieving enough career success? And one day he said, I just woke up and realized that's just not very helpful. And I made a change. I decided that I would no longer focus on my success. I would no longer take care of my career. I would take care of my people. And then everything changed because they would not let me fail. Many of you are probably feeling scared, feeling like this is a difficult time, that this is an uncertain time. But at that very time, when you've got those seats with wonderful people in those seats, this, above all times, is a time to say, I am first and foremost going to be sure to take care of my people, not my career, not my success. Question number 2. What are the brutal facts? And how can we do a better job of embracing both sides of the Stockdale paradox? Admiral Jim Stockdale was the highest ranking military officer in the Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp. He was shot down in the 1960s and he spent 8 years in the camp. He carried the burden of command in the camp. They could take him out at any time and torture him, and they did. They could keep him in leg irons, and they did for long stretches of time. And I had the great privilege to get to know Admiral Stockdale a bit when I was teaching entrepreneurship and small business at the Stanford Business School, and he was studying Stoic philosophy across the street at the Hoover Institute. And in preparation for my first meeting with and conversation with Admiral Stockdale, I sat down and I started reading his book, In Love and War, which is alternating chapters by himself and his wife about his years in the camp. And as I engaged with the pages, sitting there in my very comfortable office, I was engaging with the pages, I found myself starting to feel a bit depressed. Because it just seemed so bleak because there was no end to it. And I began to think, what would it be like to be in a situation like that, where you don't know if you're ever going to get out? You don't know if you're going to reunite with your family. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, I know the end of the story. I know we're going to see each other for the wonderful walk on Stanford campus. I know he reunites with his family. I know he becomes a national hero. But how on earth did he live it if I'm just getting depressed reading about it, living it, and not knowing the end of the story? I asked him and he said, I never wavered in my faith. Not only that I would get out, but I would turn that experience into the defining event of my life that in retrospect I would not trade. We were quiet, and I walked. And we walked in silence all the way across campus. And then I said, Admiral Stockdale, who didn't make it out as strong as you? Oh, that's easy. It was the optimists. So I'm confused. He said, what I mean by the optimists are those who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and it would go. And we're going to be out by the next Christmas. And the next Christmas would come and it would go. And they suffered from a broken heart. And that's when I learned the lesson from Admiral Stockdale, that we must, on the one hand, never confuse the need for the discipline to confront the most brutal facts. We are not going to be out of here by Christmas. With the need, on the other hand, at the same time, for unwavering faith that we can and we will prevail in the end. Years later, I was working on the research for what became Good to Great, and I kept thinking about that conversation with Admiral Stockdale, because I noticed that the Good to Great leaders who led their companies often through years of desperate difficulty, they seemed to have that same two sides. Kind of on the one side, they had this unwavering, unflinching resolve and belief and faith that they would get to the other side no matter what they faced, and they would make the company great. The company would become great. And at the same time, boy, they were good at the brutal facts. We're going to pick up and look at the ugliest things that we can and ask, what are the brutal facts that we must confront? Because if we don't confront the facts as they are, the brutal facts will certainly confront us. And we ended up dubbing it the unwavering faith, confront the brutal facts, the Stockdale paradox. Well, we are in a Stockdale time. The world's in a Stockdale moment. Your companies are in a Stockdale moment. Our countries are in a Stockdale moment. We ourselves are in a Stockdale moment. And so one of the key things is to go away and say, what we really need to do is we need to confront the brutal facts as they are. One of the greatest mistakes in public leadership, as Churchill said, is to hold out false hopes soon to be dashed by events. As leaders of companies, we cannot let that happen. We have to confront the brutal facts. And at the same time, though, all in the context of what does it mean to prevail? What does it mean to prevail and to never lose sight of that? Question number 3. How, if at all, in this time of great change, how, if at all, should we change our flywheel? Let me start with a story here. In 2001, in the fall of 2001, I was invited up to a little company in Seattle. Its name was Amazon. And I was invited to spend time with a young chief executive named Bezos, the board, and the executive team. And I went up there and basically I just taught what we'd learned in our research about what makes great companies tick. Now, at that time, those were dark days in Seattle for Amazon. It was just after the dot-com crash. And people wondered if Amazon was going to go the way of so many of the other dot-com companies and never emerge from this kind of great calamity that had hit that emerging industry. And how is Amazon going to come through it? Today we know what happened, but then it wasn't so clear. And all I did was teach the ideas. But I put special emphasis on one idea, which is the flywheel. I taught the idea of something that came from our work, which is that the way you build something great is never a single moment or a single reactionary sort of move or a single acquisition or a single momentary miracle moment. No, it's like pushing a giant heavy flywheel. You start pushing in an intelligent and consistent direction, and after a lot of effort, you get one giant slow, you turn on that flywheel. But you don't stop. You keep pushing in an intelligent and consistent direction, and you eventually get 2 and 4 and 8 and 16 and 32 and 100 and 1,000 and 1,000,000, and that flywheel's building momentum, and then boom, 100 million and 1 billion, and the flywheel hits breakthrough momentum. And that's how greatness gets built. Disciplined people who engage in disciplined thought, who take disciplined action over a long period of time, building flywheel momentum. So as I was leaving Seattle, I basically just left them with one question: how to respond to this not as a crisis. Do not respond to the dot-com crash in a reactionary doom loop where you're just reacting and falling down. Respond as a flywheel. Well, this was one of those times where the student is vastly more insightful in some ways than the teacher. And this is where I, as the teacher, became the student of the student. Because what Bezos and his team did was they grabbed the flywheel idea, but then they made it their own. And they asked a critical question, which is, how does our flywheel work? What exactly is our flywheel? And notice, I'd like you to here's the architecture of their flywheel. Think of it as kind of this loop that goes around that has inevitable momentum. If we start at the top with offering lower prices on more things for our customers, we're going to inevitably get more customer visits to our site. And if we do that, we're going to get more third-party sellers. And if we do that, then we're going to expand the store and extend distribution. And then if we do that, we're going to grow revenues per fixed cost, which then will allow us to lower prices on more stuff for our customers, and around that flywheel would go. And notice the key is it's got an inevitable logic of momentum built within it. It's not a series of steps drawn as a circle. It's a logic of momentum. I learned from what they did, and I began challenging other companies. Vanguard, the mutual fund company, came to my laboratory in Boulder, and I asked them a series of questions, and this was in the middle of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Same thing. Don't respond to this as a crisis. Respond with your flywheel. And they sat down and did a brilliant job, and they articulated their flywheel in a very simple way. We lower costs on our mutual funds. then we can't help but deliver superior returns for the same asset because the costs are lower. Simple math. And if we do that, then we can't help but generate tremendous returns, which will produce loyalty from our customers, which will increase assets under management, which will give us increased economies of scale, which will then allow us to lower costs yet again, a virtuous repeating flywheel. So you can't ask the question, how in this time should we change our flywheel, unless you have first figured out what is your flywheel. Now, there are different kinds of flywheels, right? You've got cost flywheels, you've got economies of scale flywheels, you've got people flywheels, you can have innovation flywheels, so a lot of different types of flywheels. We recently did publish a monograph, 37 pages short, that addresses these cases and shows how to get your flywheel right. So you got to get it right before you think about how to change it. And one thing I want to share that's actually not in the monograph. So when you engage with the monograph, there's something that has become clear to me since writing it. There's kind of going from 12 to 6 on the flywheel, right? Sort of down the right-hand side, and then coming up from 6 to 12. And what I've really come to see is that all the best flywheels, they figure out where they start, and then as they come down this side is all about, the right side is all about how they make the world better, how they make their customers' lives better, how they contribute. Right? So you take the Cleveland Clinic, we get the best medical physicians who can work well with others, and through a whole series of steps over here that leads to really great patient outcomes. That's how we do something good in the world. But then we come up the other side's all about capturing and redeploying fuel, whether it be profits or resources, right? And that fuel then isn't to be siphoned off to investors. It's to be redeployed back to drive the next round on the flywheel. Do something really good, create fuel, do more good, create more fuel, and around your flywheel goes. Then there comes a question. Okay, so we get our flywheel right. We want to come out of this with momentum, but our world has just changed dramatically. So what's an intelligent way to change our flywheel, if we're going to change it at all? In the book Great by Choice, Morten Hansen and I really looked at companies that were vulnerable to a very turbulent environment and often faced a need for real change or not in the face of that turbulence. And what we found was something interesting about how companies went about in times of great turbulence, figuring out what to change. We came to call it fire bullets, then fire cannonballs. So imagine you have a ship bearing down on you, and you've got a certain amount of gunpowder. And one response would be to say, I'm scared, the ship's coming, I'm uncertain, I'm going to take all my gunpowder, I'm going to put it in a big cannonball, and I'm going to fire it at that ship, sails out there, I sure hope it hits, splash, hits the water, it misses, here comes the ship, you're in trouble. But suppose instead, what you do is you put a little bit of gunpowder in a bullet, and you fire and it misses, but you see it's directionally sort of 30 degrees off, so you take your next best shot, another bullet, now you're 10 degrees off, then you take a third shot, ping, you hear the side of the ship. You have a calibrated line of sight. And now you take your gunpowder, now you put it in a cannonball, and you fire on a calibrated line of sight. I've seen lots of companies in this time wondering how to adjust, how to adapt, what to do, and so forth. Okay, we may have to make some changes. But how do you know they're not reactionary doom loops? How do you know they'll really fuel the flywheel? Well, you got to know the flywheel, number one. But number two, how do you figure out what will work? Don't fire uncalibrated cannonballs. Fire bullets. Once you have calibration, then fire the cannonball. Question number 4. What should be on our stop doing list? I mentioned earlier the idea of disciplined people who engage in disciplined thought, who take disciplined action. Well, people often think that means doing more, add, right? We got to put more things on our to-do list. Wrong answer. The first question is not what should we do, but what should we stop doing? What do we have the discipline to put on our stop doing list? This is a marvelous time to stand back and have a rigorous look and say, maybe we should clear some clutter off the flywheel. Maybe this is a time to stop doing a bunch of stuff that if we were really disciplined, we would have stopped doing a long time ago. Now, there's a key idea in this concept of preserve the core and stimulate progress. This is what enduring great companies do really well. They preserve their values, their core values, and their basic reason for being, their core reason for being that makes the world better. And they stimulate progress. They stimulate change and improvement and innovation and renewal and everything that's not part of that. And as you're making these changes, your people might say, well, wait a minute, are we giving up our values? Well, this is where you want to double down on your values, but you want to help people see that what we're doing is we understand the difference between our core values, which should never change, and our practices and our strategies. And we may be making real changes in our practices and strategies, but we're not changing our core values. And people often confuse the practices and the strategies, and it is your job to help people see the difference. No, that's a practice. It's not a core value. When Ann Baker became chief executive of her company, Telecare, she took it over from her father, who had tragically died from a medical procedure. At 29 years old, she had the family company on her shoulders, company in mental health services arena. And she knew that the company had a whole bunch of things that were kind of on the flywheel that didn't really make sense to have. And she had people wondering, what's she going to do with the company? She's going to preserve the spirit of the company that her father had so put in place. That spirit, a basic idea. We're not here to deliver services. We are here. Our core is to help people with mental impairments realize their full potential. And what she did when she first sat down with her team is to say, what we have to first figure out before we decide what's going to change is to ask what's going to never change. And what's going to never change is that core idea, that core philosophy, our core ideals. That will never change. Now with that fixed, let's think about the things that need to change. And she actually changed a lot of aspects of the business and things that they'd been in for a long time, but all true to the spirit of the core principles that her father had laid in place. Preserve the core, stimulate progress. And with that, what should we stop doing? Now, the last question. I told you there would be 5. This is number 5. How can you help someone else? How can you be of service to others in this time? In Great by Choice, Morton and I write about the great mountaineer David Brashears. David was on a great quest, a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal to put an IMAX camera on the top of Mount Everest and shoot a film from the top of the world. And he woke up in May 1996 on this adventure. And at Camp 3, he got really nervous because the night before there'd been these winds, really severe winds, hurricane force winds, and cold temperatures. And one of the principles that we always come back to is the idea of productive paranoia. Well, David is a productive paranoid. And he started doing what any productive paranoid does, which is to ask what-if questions. And what if all that cold and wind presages a ferocious storm? And then he looked down the mountain and he saw a whole bunch of other climbers coming up that same day. And he began to ask, what if all those climbers are up here with us when that storm hits and we're all caught not being able to get past each other going up and down the mountain? That would be a nightmare scenario. So he made a decision, which was we will go down to a lower camp. We'll reset. If it turns out to be a ferocious storm, we can wait it out and come back on another day. And it was a ferocious storm. And those other teams got caught in that storm. And some of them never made it back down the mountain, ever. When Morton and I asked David, so why were you able to make the decision to go down when the other teams made the decision in the exact same hour, on the same mountain, on the same day, to go up? He said, oh, well, because we could. We had more options. Well, what do you mean? We brought enough oxygen canisters for multiple summit bids. The other teams did not. So we had the option to go down. We had plenty of extra oxygen canisters, and we could make that choice. So point one is, it's what you've done to prepare before the storm comes that gives you the options of how well you're going to do when the storm comes. And some of you are out there right now are like, we did a good job with our oxygen canisters before the storm came. We're strong. There are others who are like, the storm's here, I wish we had more oxygen canisters, right? Got both. If you get through this, never get caught on the side of the mountain ever again without extra oxygen canisters. But there's something that David did. He wanted to get his IMAX camera on top of Everest, and he did. But as the storm was unfolding and people were in trouble, he also gave up a good chunk of his oxygen canisters in a great act of level 5 leadership to help in the rescue and to help save some other climbers. And I always take that away as an even greater thing than putting the IMAX camera on top of Everest. And so I ask you to think, however difficult, however scared, however uncertain you and your team are, one of the most calming and best things you can do at this time is to ask the question, who needs our help? Who can we help? How can we be of service? So take these 5 questions back, wrestle with them with your team. Thank you very much. Dan, I think I'm back in your hands.
Jim, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. It was excellent. Few questions. The first one, and this is a very tough time, but I was struck by this question from somebody in our audience who had to furlough some people. A lot of people in the audience have had to lay people off. And the question is, do you think those kinds of people are bad or ineffective leaders because their decisions impacted families and individuals? If you have to lay people off, can you still do it with grace? How do you still do it with grace and respect and still be a good leader?
So all of us at different times, whether it be for performance reasons or maybe economic reasons, have sometimes in our paths and careers had to make the very difficult decision and had the difficult conversation to let people go. All of us find this a very difficult thing. I mean, we're talking about people, right? So if you don't find it difficult, that's what I'd have a problem with. Not that you do it or you don't do it, but that if you don't find it difficult, that's where I'd be more troubled. That key phrase, rigorous, not ruthless. And I'll just share with you a personal thing that I've always found helpful, which is over the years, I personally call or reach out to or have a text exchange, voice memo to every single person that's ever been in my system that I've let go on their birthday, every single year. And I do that because the way that I know that I'm trying to handle it in the most kind and compassionate and respectful way is if I can't call them a year from now and they welcome the call and say, thank you, actually my life is in pretty good shape. I mean, that sense of I have a rigorous decision to make, but that's totally separate from I care about you as a person. And then there are other ways. What else can you do to help them? Every kind of way of supporting them, referencing them, helping them figure out what their hedgehog is, so forth. Rigorous for the company. The company has to endure. Right? You're not doing anybody any favors if the company dies. But that doesn't mean being ruthless.
Great question that a few people have asked, and it's you'd expect it given everything that's going on in the country right now. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on diversity and inclusion, especially when you're talking about getting the right people in the right seats and figuring the 90%? How does that figure into the work you've done and what you've seen?
So what our research would show, Jerry Porras and I spent a lot of time thinking about this question because it's been actually an arena of research and a particular arena of research that Jerry had been involved with for his entire arc of his career. And we talked a lot about what do we see in our research on this question. And what we found, go back to that principle of preserve the core and stimulate progress. Preserving the core means, and stimulating progress means, to stimulate progress, we should have really wide diversity. Right? Diversity stimulates progress. It makes systems stronger. Right? That is an empirical finding as well as a strong values finding. At the same time, preserve the core is we can have people who share the values that we share very passionately in our business. So if you really share the idea of helping people with mental impairments realize their full potential, which Anne went back to, right, that can be held tight while we can have a huge diversity of people who contribute to that core. So that's how they go together, and that's very much what our research showed.
Your work has been out there, and it's been your books have been classics for a couple decades now. They are, on the reading list of every executive, and they're in every executive suite. What don't people get, though? I mean, if people really were paying attention, and follow the concepts, you would think that more businesses would go well, whatever. What do you find that people miss? What's the one, the pebble that they trip over when it comes to your work?
That's a wonderful question. There's multiple ways that people get into that. I would say I would offer two things. The first is that is the idea that somehow these are business ideas. They're not business ideas. Actually, the interesting thing is my work has never really been about business. It's been about what separates great organizations, great institutions from others. If you think about it from a comparative standpoint, if they're studying great companies in contrast to companies that didn't become great, companies drops out. And what's left is great in contrast to good. And a number of years ago, in fact, probably somewhere between a third and a half of our readership comes from non-business, we discovered, produced some things for the social sectors, because what we found is that this isn't about building a successful business. This is about building a truly great institution. And the ideas apply to other walks of life as well. We've seen them in the social sectors and in education and in healthcare, right? Level 5 leadership, right people on the bus, getting the flywheel right. In the flywheel monograph, for example, we have a K-12 school that took the flywheel and used it to take reading rates for third graders from 30% to 100% and then hold it for something like 17 years. It's about greatness, not about business. That said, though, a second thing. And this I would really love to offer to people. I think one of the most noble ways to spend your life is to build a great company. We're in an era where some of the zeitgeist is not always positive about business, and people be critical about business, but think about it. Think about the idea that if you build a truly great company, a great company that employs people, a great company that does something so distinctive and with such influence, that if it disappeared, it would leave an unfillable hole. That if it disappeared, there would be people who truly would feel pained that you disappeared. They would miss you. And is able to do it over a long period of time, and is able to have that flywheel generate back into producing more flywheel turns. And it generates economics and lifts people's boats, and it does it for a wide range of people. I can think of very few things in life that add up to a more noble cause, a more noble quest than to build a company that isn't just built to last, but one that is truly worthy of lasting. One that is truly worthy of admiration. One that is truly worthy of eroding cynicism. Now that is a noble cause. And if you think about the fact that we have just one life to live, what are you going to do with it? One. And it goes by fast. What are you going to do with it? To join in common cause with other like-minded people who you love spending time with to build something great and lasting that makes a difference? Well, you have a very good answer for how to spend a life.
Jim, that's great. One question that's come up a couple times. we're working in a very difficult, dislocated time. Any tips for leaders when we're working in this virtual world right now, where maybe you're not able to be with your team all the time, and you're having to work through the kind of telepresence that we're working through right now?
So one, I actually kind of have enjoyed this time a lot. I like to say I'm genetically encoded for social distancing. I'm somebody who loves working in my research cave and just burrowing down into what I call monk mode. It's my natural mode. So I might not be the best person to ask, because I actually love the quietude, the solitude, the work. That's it. I would offer one thing. When you're doing your distributed conversations, I'd ask you to think about how you can contribute to helping your team evolve by changing your questions to statements ratio. Don't say a lot, ask a lot. And one way to bridge the gap between how you're connecting with someone isn't to tell them something, it's to ask them something and to invite them into the conversation. As one of the mentors who made a big impact on my life, a fellow named John Gardner, used to put it, don't set out in life to be an interesting person, and don't try to be interesting. Be interested, and be interested in your people.
And another question we had here, you didn't discuss this in here, but it is interesting. A question about the concept of the council. Yes. Of bringing in, maybe you can talk a little bit about that and why it's pertinent and important in the current environment.
Oh, the council. So it was very interesting. It's a great question. Somebody obviously knows chapter 5 of Good to Great. So one of the things that we really puzzled on is, so how do you get clarity, right? So we always had this image that you would get to the other end. A company made a leap from good to great, and you could get to the other end, and you could see, they got clear what they could be the best in the world at, what they're passionate about, what drove their economic engine. Then they stopped doing stuff that didn't fit with that. They built momentum. They got the flywheel going, and it's like this miracle that occurs. But there's this kind of key thing in there, which is, how did they figure all that out, right? I mean, and I had this image of like these scientists standing by a board, and there's one with a whole bunch of equations on one side, and then there's a whole bunch of equations on the other side to a point of conclusion. And then in the middle, there's this line that says, it was a cartoon, then a miracle occurs, right? and we puzzled, well, what's the miracle by which they got to the other side of clarity? What it was they first got really, this is the key seats, right? Key people in the key seats. And then they engaged in interested Socratic debate and dialogue, but infused with actual decisions, often what later we would have called firing bullets, to get calibration about what's actually working and to autopsy what doesn't work and to make sense of it, right? Which would then sort of provide a bit of clarity and then take another loop on it. It was this kind of looping process that was like, as you walk through the woods, eventually the fog clears, but because you're actually doing things, learning, processing, doing, learning, processing with the right people, clarity would eventually come. What we found was they had this thing, wasn't, quote, the executive committee, it was what we called the council, because it had executive committee members on it, but it often maybe had like a key board member or a key technologist or somebody really essential to the science. It was also part of the council. Think of it as the CPU of the enterprise.
Jim, I want to, before we go, maybe you could just leave us with some final thoughts. It's obviously one of the most disrupted times for leaders of all types that we've faced in a century. Mm-hmm. What do you think people should be? You gave us the 5 questions, but if there was an essence of what people should be focused on right now, what do you think it would be? I chose the questions because I think those are the questions. I think the main thing that I would encourage people most to think about is that when you look at history, there have been other times in history that have also been severe, and that this is life for the rest of our lives. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. History is the study of surprises, to quote Edward T. O'Donnell, the great history professor. Think about the first half of the 20th century. 1907 financial panic, 1914 World War I, 1918 flu pandemic,
Great Depression and World War II. Right? So they were sort of averaging about one a decade. We've been doing about one a decade. There is going to be no new normal. There is only going to be a consistent series of not normal. That's just what it's going to be. So if you're hoping for return to normal, you may be hoping for a very long time. But what our research shows is that through all those disruptions and all those times of great tumult, some companies navigated them exceptionally well and still came out over time as enduring great companies. And I really believe that our research shows that it's not the environment that determines how well you do. It's your own disciplines and choices that determines, in the long run, how well you do.
Well, Jim Collins, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Look forward to going back and rereading all of your books. I think they're more important than ever. So, Jim, thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Go out, help someone else.